Hello, and welcome to Pedder Unplugged, the podcast all about Tasmania's Lake Pedder. I'm Tabitha Badger. If you're unaware of the Pedder controversy, let me fill you in. In 1972, the original Lake Pedder, a 10 square kilometre glacial outwash lake in the heart of the southwest wilderness that had a definitive pink quartzite beach, was flooded for the creation of a hydroelectric storage scheme. The flooding sparked international public outcry. Even Prince Philip weighed in on the argument. This unjust destruction of a natural icon initiated the world's first Greens Value political party. Today, what's labelled as Lake Pedder on a map is a 242 square kilometre impoundment, a vast inland sea in the middle of Tasmania's Wilderness World Heritage Area. In 1995, it was established that Lake Pedder could actually be restored. You could drain the impoundment waters, and below the surface, the original beach and dune system remained intact. It was a miracle. A campaign quickly begun and raised an enormous public profile, which resulted in a federal inquiry, finding restoration technically feasible. But, as you would know, it's yet to happen. Pedder Unplugged brings you the extraordinary tales of enduring optimism, wild adventure, mishap and heartbreak told by the Pedder people themselves. Those who visited the original lake in 1972 through to those involved in the Pedder 2000 campaign. Episode 1 is with Dick Friend. Dick was the first paid employee of the Tasmanian Environment Centre, a small business owner, and he even put up his hand for state parliament. In 1972, he spent a night up a tree, in a boat, on a lake, in a tent, with campaign stalwart Brenda Hean, in a final vigil as the floodwaters rose, drowning the original Lake Pedder. It's appropriate we bring you this episode today, on September the 8th, as today's the 49th anniversary of the day Brenda tragically disappeared. She was headed to Canberra in an old Tiger Moth aircraft with pilot Max Price. The pair intended to skywrite Save Lake Pedder over the capital, but they never made it, and no trace of Brenda and Max or the Tiger Moth has ever been found since. Dick fondly recalls his time with Brenda, and we chat a little bit about the concept of wilderness too, and how our attitudes towards the natural environment have changed since Pedder's flooding. It's a real privilege to bring you this series, and an enormous thanks is extended to all the Pedder people for sharing their stories with us. We hope you enjoy episode 1 of Pedder Unplugged with Dick Friend.
I hadn't been involved in a bushwalking club or any conservation organisations prior to walking into the original Lake Pedder in 1972 to see what all the fuss was about. And I became then a committed environmentalist from then on. As I progressively learnt and read about I was more interested in the sort of future direction of industry and employment and the environment and how they all tied in. And so, I kept in touch with all of the people. In fact, I did a course then on environmental design, which was a course general. It was a Bachelor of Arts brackets environmental design with a problem-solving focus. And I used that to educate myself about how to go about solving problems. While I wasn't intending to become an architect, I was hoping to get involved in public policy questions. Anyway, so I kept in touch with environmental issues over the time, and of course had made friends during that time, and I'm not sure exactly what triggered the Pedder 2000 thing, but yeah, we're all on databases together that we'd established after the original Pedder campaign started. I've been involved in the formation of the United Tasmania Group, the first Green Party in the world.
So you said it was, the 1970s that you walked into Lake Pedder to see what all the fuss was about. What did you find when you got there?
Well, it was quite an arduous walk. It was a beautiful sunny day. I'd been working on a hop harvest in the Derwent Valley for the month before. There was an incredible celebration involving lots of barrels of beer for all the various hop workers. And I had an American guy who worked on the hop harvest too, who thought our beer was weak. So we were determined to show him that that wasn't the case, and almost didn't make it into the lake that next day because he was suffering a lot. But we did spill our way from the Scotts Peak Dam into the lake through the button grass plain, very wet, boggy ground, and we battled through. We weren't bushwalkers. What we found there was absolutely staggering. We found, after just walking through this button grass plain with these wonderful ranges on either side, you then, out of the blue, came across this pristine lake, this beautiful white quartzite beach, squeaky sand. It was just sort of such an unexpected thing. It was really, really quite something that just sort of put you back on your heels, and just had to take a big deep breath of air and say, isn't this marvellous?
How many trips did you make into Lake Pedder?
Well, this was 72, and the lake was being flooded unnecessarily. They were flooding the Serpentine Valley first to try and literally drown out the opposition, because they could have been filling the Lake Gordon catchment first and leaving Lake Pedder till later, and they could have been, gaining power from the power scheme earlier on the Lake Gordon Dam. But instead they proceeded rapidly with the Serpentine catchment, and so the water was backing up behind that. And so there wasn't much time to go in much after that weekend that I went in, March of 72. And I next went in to take, I think this was the next time, to take Brenda Hean and May Smith, two great campaigners, two mature-aged women that were doing a vigil on the dune system, which was the backdrop, the lining of the beach of Lake Pedder. And they were determined to stay there until Lake Pedder disappeared. They weren't concerned so much for their own safety. They were just committed to making sure that this was not going without a fight. This was not going without recognition. This was not going without witness. And I was asked to take them in. I'd had a little bit of experience in boating, but I was assured the boat was perfectly adequate and powered and so on. But when I turned up to take the boat and see it was a little tiny tin dish with a putt-putt outboard, my heart sort of sank a bit, and I was somewhat worried, particularly when Brenda and May brought out all the supplies they brought for at least a month or more to transport across something like, I can't remember, 10 or 15 k's of water at that stage before you got to the flooded bit. Very dangerous, large bit of water, huge winds, known in the southwest. Waves could be up to, a few feet high. And we had about 3 inches of freeboard on the side of the tin dish after we'd put their gear in and climbed in ourselves. We were blessed by a lovely day, but in the southwest it can change very rapidly, and in a few moments you can get big waves. Anyway, I'd been persuaded by the very enthusiastic Lee Holloway, who was the greatest campaigner I've personally met, who could persuade you to do things against your better judgment for the greater good. After some difficulty of even getting started with this little outboard, we started putting off along the lake towards Lake Pedder. But it took so long, pushing so much water in front of the boat as we went. It took us hours and hours and hours to get there at a very glacial pace. And eventually it started to get dark just as we were entering the part of the Serpentine, an aptly named lake, because it curled around and back on itself. And sometimes form new little channels between the meandering curves. And the trees on the highest point in the big plain was the banks of the Serpentine, which had clumps of trees rather than the button grass plain that surrounded it. And so, but to get into the lake, we had to go up this channel and find this channel. But as it was getting dark, it was very hard to see where the channel actually went. We took to even shining torches on the side of the banks to see where to go. And eventually, we took a couple of wrong branches, in the end, we had to give up. We tried to make our way to one of the big shores, some kilometres away across Button Grass Plain, but we couldn't get through the various trees on either side and couldn't see our way anyway. In the end, we made a decision. We had to stay in the boat overnight. And this was obviously a dangerous undertaking on a huge lake where they could have, 3-4 foot waves. We thought, well, there was no other choice, but we wedged the boat amongst the upper branches of flooded trees on the banks of the Serpentine, wedged the boat in there, and we put all the gear in the bottom of the boat. We erected a tent, strung it up in the uppermost branches and spread it over the sides of the boat, rolled out our sleeping bags along the thing, and two young guys heads up one end and two mature ladies with their heads up the other. Well, I was absolutely exhausted from the mental exertion of all this, and I went out like a light. I slept. But the boat rocked a bit, apparently, during the night. Brenda Hean, this very avid, strong campaigner and bushwalker, and she suffered from seasickness during the night. May Smith sort of was awake attending to Brenda. Lee said he woke up a number of times, but in the morning they had to wake me to get up and going, which we eventually did. We had to somehow organise our ablutions in a tiny tin dish. We variously, after looking various other ways, we composed ourselves and proceeded on. It was quite easy to find our way in the light up the channel of the Serpentine River, which was the river draining excess water from Lake Pedder, from the original Lake Pedder. We eventually, in about an hour or so, we got to Lake Pedder and we unloaded these two incredible campaigners onto the beach, supposedly safe. After a cup of tea we brewed, Lee and I thought, well, we better start making our way back. God knows what the weather was going to do. And we did. So all was well. The most incredible night to spend, have 4 people in a tin dish, in a boat, on a lake, up a tree, in a tent.
What were the spirits of Brenda and May like when you left them on the dunes?
These women were the most extraordinary women. Brenda sort of never had a hair out of place. She was very carefully spoken, very carefully dressed, but she was a great bushwalker. But in the city, she would always have, high heels, a handbag, lipstick, and she was properly made and hair always done to perfection. May was a different kettle of fish. She was ready to go and raring to go wherever she was, and it was amazing. The two got on famously, and they were just united in this determination to see the course of this campaign and do whatever it took. And as you know, that Brenda later volunteered to go in a Tiger Moth flight to signwrite Save Lake Pedder over Canberra. And we don't know for sure, but suspect that disappearance of that Tiger Moth was due to sabotage. She was very undaunted in her determination to do this. This very polite, very proper woman with such a fierce belief and determination that this part of world's best wilderness was just an essential thing that at all costs had to be saved. And so people like myself subsequently, I was only 20 or so, now 49 years later, it's still one of life's dearest objectives to see Lake Pedder restored to its original situation.
So when you were a student at the time, what was the consensus among the other young people about the issue of Pedder? Were they aware of it? Were they campaigning to save the lake?
This was the first really massive environmental campaign. It's the first one that got people out onto the streets, that got people marching. But it was a very divisive campaign. I mean, so many people had members of their families or some that worked for the Hydroelectric Commission or worked for other established organisations that seemed to depend on this whole concept that the state was progressing due to the hydroelectric development. By 1972, there'd been no new big industries that had established in Tasmania attracted by cheap hydroelectricity. The last one was in, I think, 1967 in Tempco, and this was 5 years later. But the Hydroelectric Commission was saying that we needed to double the amount of electric power every 10 years. They actually produced graphs that showed this. We had another good campaigner that looked at those graphs and noticed how they were plotted on logarithmic curves, and he plotted some of these demand curves back onto arithmetic graphs, just graphs as we know, which told a completely different story. So I do remember going from the Environment Centre and handing out these flyers that we'd produced, showing it, handing them out on the steps of the Hydroelectric Commission. A very provocative act. We thought we'd get a lot more publicity than that, but the Mercury newspaper at the time didn't really give much. It was still a very controversial thing to suggest that hydroelectric development should be in any way. And there wasn't an understanding of wilderness. Wilderness was, and the need for wilderness was a new concept. It was still very much a frontier mentality. Nature was almost the enemy, you know. Trees were to be chopped down, land was to be cleared, pasture was to be developed. It wasn't considered to be our ally. It was something to be fought, something to be developed. The Lake Pedder campaign was one of the ways in which we moved the understanding from being a frontier war with nature to having to appreciate nature, to work with it, to benefit from it. It was all, you know, it's a very long process. We're still not there, are we?
No, that was going to be my next question is, have you felt that there's been that shift in the appreciation of wilderness, particularly in Tasmania? Are we taking what we have, or we are partially taking what we have for granted? But do you feel like there's a greater awareness, perhaps even nationally, in what Tasmania has from that initial Pedder campaign to today, when we see these younger people like myself who have never visited Lake Pedder but want to see it restored? It's always fascinating, the values side of the campaign and what people appreciate.
Oh, look, absolutely. It's changed dramatically. I remember attending lectures by Dr. Dick Jones at the university. I did a science, part of a science degree there. And he was talking about wilderness and what is wilderness and trying to put definitions on it. And I found it fascinating. And it's a book that has later been written by Martin Hawes, looking at what is the definition of wilderness. The one I particularly liked, because it was a new concept at the time, I liked the one that said wilderness is areas that you can't access unless you walk, and have to walk so far that you've got to sleep out, because otherwise, if you can drive to it, it's not really a wild place. It's accessible. It's not really wild. And wilderness, it's amazing if you do graphs of where you have to walk and sleep out before you can get back, you've generally got the best wild places. But of course, it's a very imperfect one, because there's it might be a little track in somewhere that somebody can access by four-wheel drive. You wouldn't want to see all wilderness areas denied because of some old track or something. But it was interesting that in those times, we didn't really have a definition or an understanding of wilderness at all. And it only began then. It was campaigns like the Lake Pedder one that then began when the campaign to flood another river, the Franklin, came. There was already a great skill set, a great knowledge base, and a great upwelling of people's interest in the natural environment. One could very confidently say that if it hadn't been for the Lake Pedder campaign, the Franklin River would have been dammed, as the hydro was well in train in undertaking that engineering work. And it wouldn't have been stopped but for the Lake Pedder campaign, creating a whole new understanding of the need for wild places.
There was a bit of a communication conundrum that you experienced once with Pedder, and you had a code with some people at the vigil and it all got completely misinterpreted and went wrong.
Yes, it was a later vigiler called Chris Tevitt, who was camped on the dunes in the very late stages. He was camped there alone. He was a young fellow in his 20s. He had a radio that was powered by a 12-volt car battery, and because it couldn't be recharged, he had no generator. He used to make a very brief call on the state emergency network, or Radio Hobart, which went to, outlying boats and that sort of thing, to keep the transmission very brief, to say that he was okay. And we wanted also to know things like, the water level and the general conditions, and that there were no particular emergencies. A code had been developed by an engineer by the name of Les Southwell, and Les had done a code of 0 to 9 and what each of the numbers meant. Then somebody augmented it with some extra numbers up to 16. Anyway, we were getting these messages through. We got one message through which went to Hobart Radio, and then Hobart Radio would ring it through to us, or we would ring Hobart Radio to get the scheduled message. And we got this code which indicated there was a message and someone was injured. We're a bit worried very worried about this, but we weren't quite sure about how that code had worked, whether the code had worked right. We waited for another message which would have come at the schedule a few hours later, and meantime we prepared to go. Without getting any message at the next scheduled call later in the day, we headed off at great speed. A colleague who worked as a milkman in the morning and was very fit, he used to leap over the fences with his milk bottles and did the rounds, I think something like half the speed, in half the time that previous milkman had done that round, and then he'd come and work for the Lake Pedder campaign. Anyway, we headed off in his mini miner at great speed up to the Gordon River Road, where we went over the range. He ran over. I started to run and then ran out of puff and puffed and panted behind him, but he ran right in. Eventually we got into where the waters, by this stage, were right up, and you couldn't connect with the dune system. It was water lapping around the dunes. We signalled to Chris Tevitt, who lazily rowed over and picked us up. There had a dinghy there, and there was no problem at all. What had happened was this code, the combination of 1 and 4 or something, was 14, which he'd put down. Everything was okay, but the other way of reading it was that it was an emergency. Please come and help. One can laugh a little bit about the code, but in the meantime, we'd alerted Tas Police that there was a potential emergency, and we're headed off in Raceville. It was nice to be able to get on the next scheduled call to Hobart Radio and assure them that everyone was okay. Of course, I blamed Les Southwell at the time, engineer, for the code, but I think it was probably somebody who'd augmented it at a later time. And so that was my, I think, third trip to, at least to the dunes, or to the original Lake Pedder. Some went multiple times, but as somebody who only first saw it in early 72, I was very lucky to have seen it at all and to have those 2 subsequent trips in.
Today, when you visit the Southwest, what's it like seeing the impoundment there?
Dull. It really is dull, just by comparison. I mean, people sometimes say, it's beautiful because of the range, and you can have some wonderful photography still, and you can have reflections of some of the water. But just knowing what was there before, the original lake was unique. It was a glacial lake in this huge plain. Water trickled in from just near one end and out the other, but from a couple of kilometres from one side of Lake Pedder, water would go to the east coast, down through the Huon River, through Huonville, and out to the east coast. And from just beside Lake Pedder, through Mariah Creek into Lake Pedder, and then out through the Serpentine, it would go to the west coast. And it was a big, long valley. This was sort of quite unique to have this glacial lake, which fed this valley, which fed water in two different directions. And so there was a unique ecosystem, and there were unique geological features, the Pedder pennies, that are bizarre little geological formation. And of course, there were lots of botanical and zoological species that in the very short time before the floodings happened, 22 species or something unique to the area were found. And of course, a lot more time, if it had been available, would have revealed a lot more. And we hope that, as many as possible of those will survive. A couple have been moved to other glacial lakes nearby, and hopefully, we will be able to restore as many of the species, discover ones that perhaps we'd not ever discovered before when we restore the lake.
Absolutely. And I love that you say when we restore the lake, because it seems so much about Pedder is miraculously there to be restored, like you say about the Pedder galaxis population that's been translocated to Lake Oberon, and it's locally extinct within the Pedder impoundment now, but we have got that reserve population that could go back, and that the dunes and beach system are still intact. It's a miracle. It's only got such a minimal amount of sediment on it, and everything about it is just incredible. But what is it that after all this time you're still so heavily involved in the campaign, and what is it that's kept you going and kept you optimistic?
Oh, it's unfinished business. We saw amazing changes in people's perceptions, particularly in the early days of the Pedder campaign. But once the area was flooded, it was hard to maintain any real enthusiasm to change it. But as people have got involved in other campaigns and learnt more, and more people have become aware of the need for an understanding of wilderness and nature conservation and the importance of the natural environment, there is the ability for this to be revisited. And all hydroelectric schemes have a lifespan. Dams have lifespans. And we know that, there are dams in the Lake Pedder catchment that are having lots of money scheduled to be spent on them. And we obviously think that we could do better with that money and actually remove them instead of making them last longer. There is the ability now to really review this after 50 years. There is no better time to do it. The lake, we know that the environment is there. We know that the environment can be restored, that it won't be just a mud pile, which the detractors like to suggest it could become. There have been examples of other similar lakes that give us the confidence that we will be able to have a pristine lake restored. So let's go for it.
Thank you so much, Dick. You're an absolute legend, and thank you for all that you've done in your time today as well.
It's a pleasure, and try and channel Brenda Hean and May Smith and Lee Holloway and say the job's never done until we get there.
That was episode 1 of Pedder Unplugged with Dick Friend. Dick is stuck in isolation in Victoria, so we recorded this episode via Zoom. Apologies for the small audio errors within it. If you'd like to know more about Pedder, visit lakepedder.org today. I'm Tabitha Badger. Thanks for listening.